On January 26, 1943, Commander Dudley Morton, commanding officer of USS Wahoo, ordered his crew to fire on Japanese soldiers and sailors in the water of the Vitiaz Strait north of New Guinea. The men in the water were survivors of the transport Buyo Maru, which Wahoo had torpedoed approximately 30 minutes earlier. Some of them were swimming, some were in lifeboats, some were on rafts, some were clinging to wreckage. They were not posing a threat to the submarine. They were in the water, and they were alive, and Morton ordered them killed. This is not disputed. Morton himself included the action in his patrol report. He described the survivors in the water, and he described the decision to engage them, and he submitted that report through the chain of command to Admiral Charles Lockwood at Pearl Harbor. Lockwood read the patrol report. Lockwood praised the patrol. Wahoo received a Presidential Unit citation for the 4th patrol that included the Buyo Maru action. Morton received a Second Navy Cross. The question of what exactly happened in the Vitiaz Strait on January 26, 1943, why it happened, whether it was a war crime under the law then applicable, and why it was not investigated or prosecuted in any form either during the war or after it, has occupied naval historians for decades and has not produced a simple answer that satisfies everyone who examines it. The answer that the evidence does support is one that the American post-war narrative about the submarine service spent considerable effort avoiding, and it is worth examining in full because the avoidance is itself part of the historical record. Start with Wahoo and with Morton because the incident cannot be separated from the specific culture the boat had developed under his command. USS Wahoo was a Gado-class fleet submarine commissioned in May 1942 at the Mare Island Navy Yard in Vallejo, California. She was 311 feet long, displaced 1,526 tons surfaced, carried 24 torpedoes, and had a crew of approximately 80 men. Her early patrols under her first commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Marvin Kennedy, had been cautious and unproductive, and Kennedy was eventually reassigned. The submarine force's culture in 1942 regarded excessive caution as a serious professional failing, and Kennedy's conservative approach to attack had produced results that the command found inadequate. Dudley Walker Morton assumed command of Wahoo in December 1942. He was 37 years old, a Naval Academy graduate, a large, physically imposing man with an aggressive tactical philosophy that was essentially the opposite of everything his predecessor had practiced. Morton's approach to submarine command was built around one principle: attack. Attack constantly, attack aggressively, attack regardless of the escort strength or the tactical complications, and do not break off an attack once committed, regardless of what the enemy's response produced. This philosophy had produced extraordinary results on Morton's 3rd patrol in January 1943, in the days immediately preceding the Buyo Maru action, when Wahoo had attacked a Japanese convoy and sunk multiple ships in sustained operations that demonstrated exactly the kind of aggressive command the submarine force was trying to develop across the entire Pacific Fleet. Morton's executive officer on Wahoo was Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, who would go on to become the most decorated American submarine officer of the entire war, and who would command USS Tang with a ferocity and skill that the Pacific Submarine Service regarded as the highest expression of its operational philosophy. O'Kane admired Morton. He described his commanding officer's approach to submarine warfare in terms that the post-war submarine community embraced as the definition of what the service required. He was not an uncritical admirer, but his criticisms of Morton were tactical rather than ethical, and the Buyo Maru action appears in O'Kane's post-war memoir in terms that emphasize the tactical reasoning rather than the moral dimensions. On January 26, 1943, Wahoo was operating in the Vitiaz Strait between New Britain and New Guinea when her radar and then her lookouts detected a Japanese convoy. The convoy included the transport Buyo Maru, a vessel of approximately 5,400 tons that was transporting Japanese soldiers to Wewak on the northern coast of New Guinea as part of the reinforcement of the 18th Army. The Buyo Maru was carrying approximately 2,000 men, a combination of combat troops and military personnel. Morton attacked the convoy. He fired multiple torpedoes at Buyo Maru and achieved hits that sank the transport. He also attacked the convoy's escorts, damaging at least one destroyer. The torpedo attacks on Buyo Maru were straightforward acts of submarine warfare against a legitimate military target. A transport ship carrying troops to a war zone was a lawful target under any applicable standard of international law. The sinking of Buyo Maru was legal. It was the act of a skilled and aggressive submarine commander doing precisely what the Navy had trained and equipped him to do. What followed was different. After Buyo Maru sank, the survivors of the transport were in the water of the Vidyas Strait. The exact number of men who survived the initial sinking is not definitively established in the available sources, but the Buyo Maru had been carrying approximately 2,000 people, and transport sinkings in the Pacific at this range from shore typically produced survivor groups in the hundreds. The survivors were in lifeboats, on rafts, on wreckage, and in the water swimming. Morton ordered Wahoo to engage them. The patrol report's description of this phase of the action is specific enough to establish what happened without ambiguity. Wahoo used her deck gun and her machine guns. The engagement continued for a period that the patrol report does not precisely specify, but that the descriptions of the action suggest lasted long enough to kill a substantial number of the people in the water. The precise death toll from the post-sinking action cannot be established from American records, partly because the number of survivors from the initial sinking is not precisely known, and partly because the Japanese records of the Buyo Maru's fate have their own gaps. Japanese records after the war indicated that approximately 1,126 people survived to be rescued, out of approximately 2,000 who had been aboard. The gap between the total aboard and the survivors is not fully accounted for by the sinking itself. Morton's stated tactical justification, as described in the patrol report, and as O'Kane's memoir elaborated later, was that the survivors in the lifeboats and on the rafts posed a potential threat to the submarine. Some of the troops aboard Buyo Maru were armed. Some of the lifeboats contained weapons. Morton's reasoning was that a lifeboat full of armed soldiers that came close enough to Wahoo's hull could potentially cause casualties to the submarine's crew if she surfaced to reload or for any other purpose. He also reasoned that the survivors, if not killed, would reach shore and reinforce the Japanese garrison at Wewak, meaning the transport's mission would partially succeed even after the ship was sunk. These arguments have been examined by historians with results ranging from partial acceptance to outright rejection, and the examination deserves honest presentation because the historical record is genuinely complicated. The argument that armed survivors in lifeboats posed a threat to Wahoo has a specific factual problem. The submarine was not required to approach the lifeboats. The survivors were in lifeboats and in the water. Wahoo was a 311-foot submarine with the choice of maintaining any distance from the survivors it chose. The tactical threat that survivors in lifeboats could plausibly pose to a submarine that was not approaching them was minimal to non-existent. If the concern was that the survivors would reach shore and reinforce the garrison, that concern applied to any transport sinking and would have justified the same action against the survivors of any ship Wahoo sank at any point in the war. Morton did not apply this reasoning to any other transport sinking during his command of Wahoo. The Buyo Maru action was specific and singular. The legal framework that applied to the treatment of shipwreck survivors in 1943 was the Hague Convention of 1907, specifically Article 16 of Hague Convention 11, which prohibited the destruction of enemy vessels and boats that were in a helpless position and posed no actual threat. The survivors in the water after Buyo Maru sank were, under any reasonable interpretation of this standard, in a helpless position. The convention's applicability to submarine warfare had been contested since the First World War, when unrestricted submarine warfare raised similar questions that were never definitively resolved. By 1943, the legal status of various categories of survivors in the Pacific was genuinely ambiguous, and the American submarine force was operating under a doctrine of unrestricted submarine warfare that had been declared on the first day of the Pacific War and that had explicitly abandoned the cruiser rules requiring submarines to ensure the safety of survivors before sinking a vessel. The abandonment of cruiser rules by the American submarine force did not automatically make killing survivors in the water legal. It removed the obligation to ensure survival before sinking. It did not establish a positive permission to kill survivors after sinking. These are different legal positions, and the distinction matters. What Morton ordered at the Buyo Maru was not refusing to rescue survivors, which the abandonment of cruiser rules permitted. It was actively killing them, which was a different act with a different legal status. The specific category of men in the water who were fired upon is itself subject to some dispute. The patrol report and O'Kane's subsequent account established that the people in the water included both military personnel, soldiers of the 18th Army, and possibly some crew of the Buyo Maru herself. The presence of armed soldiers in some of the lifeboats is attested in the American accounts. The presence of unarmed men in the water and on rafts who were not in a position to threaten the submarine is also attested, and these men were killed alongside those who were potentially armed. There is a further dimension to the Buyo Maru action that the post-war accounts have sometimes obscured, and that the specific context of January 1943 in the Pacific makes relevant. The Japanese military's treatment of Allied prisoners of war and of civilians in occupied territories was already widely known in broad terms within the American military command structure by early 1943. The Bataan Death March had occurred in April 1942. Reports of Japanese mistreatment of prisoners were circulating in American military channels throughout the year. The Japanese I-8's massacres of Allied merchant sailors had not yet occurred, but the general pattern of Japanese conduct toward prisoners was becoming clear. None of this context makes what happened at the Buyo Maru legally or morally legitimate. The law of war requires that enemy combatants who are in a position of helplessness, who have laid down their arms, or who are incapable of resistance due to their circumstances, be treated according to the protections applicable to prisoners of war. The fact that the enemy has committed atrocities does not create a legal permission for reciprocal atrocities. This principle was established in international law long before 1943 and was not contested by the United States in its formal position on the laws of war. It is also true, and requires honest acknowledgement, that the men who served in submarines in the Pacific in early 1943 were operating in a command and operational culture that had been shaped by the specific horrors of the first year of the war in ways that produced attitudes toward Japanese military personnel that the laws of war did not permit, but that the institutional culture had not actively policed. The submarine force was simultaneously being celebrated for aggressive command, rewarded for tonnage sunk, and operating under an unrestricted warfare doctrine that had removed the most visible legal restraint on submarine operations. The specific additional step of firing on survivors in the water was a step that the culture had not prevented, and that the chain of command declined to investigate when it was explicitly reported. The patrol report Morton submitted described the Buyo Maru action, including the post-sinking firing on survivors. It described it in terms that were operational rather than confessional, presenting the decision as a tactical judgment rather than an ethical one. Lockwood read the report, acknowledged it, and praised the patrol. The citation for the Presidential Unit citation specifically referenced Wahoo's operations during the 4th Patrol without specifically citing the Buyo Maru survivor action, but without specifically excluding it either. No investigation was initiated. No disciplinary action was taken. No legal review was conducted. The action was absorbed into the patrol record, and the patrol record was praised. This institutional response, the explicit non-response, is itself a significant part of the historical record. The chain of command that read Morton's patrol report and chose to praise it rather than question it made a decision about whether the treatment of Buyo Maru's survivors would be investigated. That decision was made by identifiable officers at specific points in the chain of command. Lockwood was the most senior officer who read and responded to the report. His response was praise. The decision not to investigate was therefore a decision made by the institutional leadership of the American submarine force. The reasons why Lockwood made this decision are not fully documented in any surviving record that specifically addresses it. The range of possible explanations includes the possibility that Lockwood read the report and did not clearly register the legal implications of what Morton described. It includes the possibility that Lockwood registered the implications and made a deliberate choice not to pursue them because the broader value of Morton's aggressive command culture to the submarine force's overall effectiveness outweighed the legal problems posed by this specific action. It includes the possibility that Lockwood's own attitudes toward Japanese military personnel in early 1943 were such that the action did not register to him as requiring investigation. It includes the possibility that the institutional culture of the submarine force in early 1943 simply had not developed the reflex that would have prompted investigation of a post-sinking action described in operational rather than ethical terms. The honest answer is that the available historical record does not definitively establish which of these explanations is correct, and it may be that some combination of all of them is closer to the truth than any single explanation. Morton's own character is a relevant part of this analysis, though it also resists simple characterization. The man who ordered the Buyo Maru firing on survivors was the same man whose aggressive command had already produced extraordinary results and would continue to produce extraordinary results through Wahoo's subsequent patrols. He was, by universal account, a compelling leader, a man his crew admired and followed with genuine devotion, a tactician whose instincts and skills were extraordinary. He was also a man who, in a specific tactical situation in January 1943, made a decision that the law of war did not permit and that the chain of command declined to examine. These are not contradictory facts. A man can be a genuinely skilled and inspiring leader and can also commit an act that the laws of war classify as a war crime. The two things coexist in the historical record of the Buyo Maru, and they require coexistence in any honest account of what happened. Wahoo continued her combat operations after the 4th patrol with the same aggressive character that Morton had established. The 5th, 6th, and 7th patrols produced significant sinkings and continued to build Morton's reputation as one of the submarine force's most effective commanding officers. Wahoo was lost on her 7th patrol in October 1943, sunk in the La Perouse Strait by Japanese aerial attack. Morton and his entire crew were killed. There were no survivors from Wahoo's company. The loss of Wahoo and Morton, celebrated in the submarine force as the loss of exceptional men in the performance of extraordinary service, meant that any post-war accounting of the Buyo Maru action would have to proceed without the testimony of the man who ordered it. Morton was not available to explain his reasoning, to defend his decision, or to face any process that might have examined it. He died as a celebrated war hero and was commemorated as such. The post-war treatment of the Buyo Maru incident in the historical literature followed a pattern that reflects the broader reluctance in American military history, writing to examine acts committed by Americans that might be classified as war crimes. Clay Blair's monumental 1975 History of the American Submarine Force, Silent Victory, addressed the Buyo Maru action directly and concluded that Morton's actions were justified by the tactical circumstances. Theodore Roscoe's earlier submarine history largely avoided the issue. O'Kane's memoir, published in 1907, addressed the action in terms that emphasized the tactical reasoning without engaging the legal or ethical dimensions in any sustained way. The Japanese historical perspective on the Buyo Maru is represented primarily by the testimony of survivors, which reached the historical record through post-war Japanese accounts and through the specific documentation that the International Prosecution Section of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal compiled. The Japanese government raised the Buyo Maru action during the Tokyo trials. It was not among the charges that the tribunal proceeded with against American personnel, partly because the tribunal's focus was on Japanese war crimes, and partly because the political and institutional circumstances of the occupation made prosecuting American officers for wartime actions politically impossible, regardless of the legal merits. There is a specific survivor account from the Buyo Maru that belongs in this record. A Japanese Army lieutenant who survived the transport's sinking and the subsequent events provided testimony through the official Japanese war crimes investigation process. His account described survivors in the water being fired upon systematically, described the specific sounds and sights of the engagement, and described his own survival by remaining motionless among bodies in the water until the firing stopped. His account corroborated the basic facts of Morton's own patrol report, while providing the perspective of someone who experienced the event from inside a lifeboat rather than from a submarine's bridge. The lieutenant survived the war. His testimony was provided to the international investigators and is preserved in the documentary record of the Tokyo trials. He was a military officer and a combatant. The fact that his account corroborates the basic outline of what happened does not require that his political interpretation of the event be accepted uncritically. It does require that his specific factual account of what happened be given the same weight as any other witness testimony about a documented historical event. The historical assessment of the Buyo Maru action that emerges from the full record, considered without the specific institutional pressures that shaped how it was addressed at the time and how it was written about for decades afterward, is this. Commander Morton ordered his crew to fire on survivors in the water after sinking a Japanese transport. The survivors were in a helpless condition. The tactical justifications offered do not satisfy the legal standard applicable to the treatment of shipwreck survivors under the law of war as it existed in 1943. The action was reported through the chain of command and not investigated. The institutional response was praise. Morton died before any post-war accounting was possible. The legal questions were never adjudicated. What happened at the Buyo Maru does not define the totality of what USS Wahoo was, or what Dudley Morton was. A submarine that killed survivors in the water was also a submarine whose crew performed extraordinary acts of skill and courage across multiple combat patrols. A commanding officer who gave an unlawful order was also a commanding officer of genuine tactical brilliance, who inspired genuine devotion in the men who served under him. The historical record contains all of these things simultaneously, and any account of Wahoo that omits any of them is an account that has traded accuracy for a simpler narrative than the evidence permits. One of the men who served on Wahoo through her 4th patrol and the Buyo Maru action was motor machinist's mate first class George Mish of Cleveland, Ohio, who had been with the boat since her commissioning and who served in the engineering spaces through the entire period of Morton's command. Mish was 24 years old at the time of the Buyo Maru action. He was in the engine room during the torpedo attack on the transport and during the subsequent post-sinking firing on survivors. The engine room crew on a submerged submarine does not have direct observation of the surface actions the ship is engaged in. They receive information through the communication systems and through the sounds that surface actions produce, and they manage the engineering plant that the tactical situation requires. Mish's experience of January 26, 1943, was therefore mediated through the communication channels and the machinery sounds of an engine room, not through direct observation of what was happening on the surface. He continued in Wahoo's service through the 5th and 6th patrols. He was transferred to shore duty before the 7th patrol, which was the patrol from which Wahoo did not return. His transfer therefore saved his life, through the mechanics of the Navy's rotation system, rather than any decision he made. He returned to Cleveland after the war and worked for 29 years as a mechanic at a manufacturing plant. He married in 1946 and had 2 sons. He attended Wahoo reunion events in the 1950s and 1960s before the surviving crew members became too few and too scattered for the reunions to continue. He died in 1989 at the age of 70. His son, in an account written for a Cleveland Naval History Archive in 2004, described his father as a man who did not speak about the war in any specific terms. He said his father had attended the reunions and had maintained contact with several other crew members through letters over the years, but that the specific content of those letters and of the reunion conversations was not something his father brought home in any form his family could access. He said his father had described his submarine service in general terms when asked, emphasizing the technical demands of the engineering work and the quality of the men he served with, but that specific actions or specific events were not something he discussed. His son said he had read, after his father's death, the historical accounts of Wahoo's patrols that had by then been published in the submarine history literature. He had read the accounts of the Buyo Maru action. He had read the patrol report descriptions and the historians' analyses. He said he did not know whether his father thought about the Buyo Maru action in the years after the war and had kept his thoughts private, or whether the engine room distance from the surface events had produced a different relationship to those events than the men on the deck and the bridge had. He said he thought about asking his father, in the years when asking was still possible, and had not asked, and he had no satisfactory account of why he had not. He said the letters his father exchanged with other crew members were in a box in the attic. He had read some of them. The letters discussed reunions, family news, the health of the men's wives and children. They did not, in any letter his son found, discuss the 4th patrol. He said he did not know whether that silence was the silence of men who had nothing to discuss, or men who had decided not to discuss it, or something else he did not have the language for. He said he was still thinking about it. Did anyone in your family serve on USS Wahoo or in the American submarine force in the Pacific? Drop their name in the comments. History requires all of it, including the parts that are hardest to look at directly.